to our session on Black and Indigenous histories of survival and solidarity. Very quickly, my name is Kevin Edmonds, and I'm going to be moderating the first of two sessions this afternoon. I work in Caribbean Studies at the University of Toronto, and I'm really happy to be part of this first panel that we have organized on the scholar strike. So before we get moving into the discussions and conversation, I just wanted to open up with a land acknowledgement. So given the majority of us involved in today's event are based in and speaking from Toronto, it's important to remember that we're here today on stolen land. If you've been to other events in the city, it's very likely that you've heard the names of the Indigenous and First Nations peoples listed in the land acknowledgements, the Huron-Wendat, the Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. You'll also have heard that this territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Bell Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Ojibwe allied nations. But just to push this typical land acknowledgement a bit further, I wanted to speak to it as it talks about as if the past was settled and the present is not accompanied with violence and erasure, as the future that we currently face is clouded by a series of existential threats. A lot of it is due to our inability to face the histories and organize to build alternatives. In this era of reconciliation, we need to recognize that Indigenous land is still being taken at gunpoint, and our Indigenous brothers and sisters across Turtle Island continue to be killed by the police with impunity. In order to build the land acknowledgement and have a connection with what we're going to be talking about today, I wanted to highlight that while there are a lot of important differences between the situations Indigenous and Black people in the Americas face, there are also incredibly important similarities, connections, and opportunities for solidarity. As Black people who have been displaced from their homelands due to histories of enslavement, there's a connected and complicated relationship of dispossession and displacement through colonial structures and imperious ideologies. After all, in many places in the Americas, stolen lands have also needed stolen bodies for labor, and the theft and genocidal violence goes hand in hand. So with that, I would like to introduce our speakers for this first panel. Our first speaker will be Melanie Newton, Associate Professor of History at the University of Toronto, who will be speaking about Indigenous society in 18th century St. Vincent. I would also like to take a moment to give some infinite respect to our incredible Professor Newton for sharing the space with us. So this is the regular time of her undergraduate class, Indigeneity in the Caribbean. And I also wanted to shout out her students that are joining us online. Our second speaker will be Shawna Sweeney, who is an Assistant Professor of History and Women and Gender Studies at the University of Toronto, and who will be speaking about climate change and racial capitalism, possibilities for Black and Indigenous survival. And last but not least, our final speaker will be Tamara Walker, Associate Professor of History at the University of Toronto, who will be speaking about the parallel struggles, or how the parallel struggles against anti-Black racism and inequality in Latin America are complicated by the national rhetorics dating back to the 19th century that sought to erase racial distinctions. So just very quickly, presentations are going to be approximately 10 to 12 minutes, so please state a time. And with that, I would like to hand it over to Professor Newton. And I'm just going to bring up your slides here.
Okay. Okay. All right, so thanks to everyone. Can everyone hear me? Yes, okay. So I'll just try to keep track of time, try to be very, very disciplined. So, so today I'm talking about, this is the subject matter of the class that I would have been teaching at this time, but it also is the research that I do. So I want to talk about entanglements of survival and build on a few things that my colleague Kevin Edmonds said about the ways that histories of survival and freedom and struggle, but also dispossession for Black and Indigenous peoples in the Americas intersect and are entangled, even as there are, because the logics of colonialism positioned Indigenous people and Black people in interrelated, but also somewhat different ways, that does not necessarily mean that these struggles are exactly the same. But I really want to point to some really crucial and I think under little known moments in the history of the Caribbean that speak to an ongoing history of entanglement and the way that people have used those entanglements to build very powerful communities of solidarity and survival. And I want to focus on the island of St. Vincent as a very powerful and important example of that history. So I'll be talking about these historical geographies of survival, of community rebirth and transformation, and the ways that Black and Indigenous peoples have worked together in the face of colonialism to construct alternate ways of being, alternate ways of building community, and alternate ways of surviving. So if we could go to the next slide. So I'll just keep talking while the slide, there it is. So this is a slide of students who I've taught will know this map very well. This is a map that is based on some 17th century, actually missionary renderings and transliterations of Indigenous place names for Caribbean islands. And the island that I'm going to be focusing on is the island of St. Vincent, which you should be able to see on the map, which is called Yulumain with L's in this map, but is better pronounced as Yurume. That's the Indigenous name for St. Vincent. But I'm going to start on an island that is just to the north. It's the sort of island that looks like a butterfly. It's the island of Turuquera or Guadeloupe. So the main part of what I'm going to discuss today focuses on the 18th century in St. Vincent, but we have to step back a little bit to the very first century of European colonization in the Caribbean, which was really focused between 1492 and the mid-16th century on islands that are not on this map in the Northern Caribbean, the Greater Antilles, which is where the Spanish first began the invasion of the Caribbean. So for the islands of the Lesser Antilles, for Indigenous Antillean people there, this is a period not necessarily of direct establishment of European settlements, but nevertheless of catastrophe and of demographic catastrophe, but also of community recreation. So the arrival of the Spanish in the mainland, which is off this map, so the mainland of the Americas and in the Northern Caribbean, sets off effectively a massive refugee crisis, as well as a pandemic crisis. And it really does transform the human geography of the Lesser Antilles. But what you see in this period is a reemergence, a process of ethnogenesis and recreation of Indigenous communities as people are adopted into these societies. And this becomes a way on which people who are fleeing violence elsewhere in the Americas survive and build new communities, but it also becomes a way in which the Indigenous societies of the Lesser Antilles, so the Eastern Caribbean themselves, respond to this crisis. So this is a period that is not well documented in European historical documents, but it is an incredibly important period. And this process of transformation, adopting new people into to these societies, responding to the crisis of colonization, and the beginnings of the expansion of African enslavement. This period is incredibly critical to the kinds of societies that then emerge in the Lesser Antilles. So at the very sort of end of this early period, before the actual invasion of the Lesser Antilles really begins, there's an incredible story from one particular narrative from about the early 17th century. This is an Englishman who stowed away on a Spanish ship. So the Spanish, in order to get to their colonies in the Pacific, had to stop in the Caribbean, take on wood and water, wash their clothes and so on, stay overnight, and then sail down the tip of Tierra del Fuego in South America and then up to what they called South Sea. So this is a period where you don't have European settlements in the Lesser Antilles, but it is a major, major point in this emerging world of transatlantic colonialism. And there is a story where this Englishman, he was stowed away on a ship. They stopped, the Spanish ship, they stopped on the island of Turuquera or Guadeloupe. This was in about 1613. And there were a number of Jesuits, Spanish Jesuits on the ship. And while they were there on Guadeloupe, they happened to see a Black man, a Black Spanish man, it turned out. He'd been born in Spain, he'd been enslaved in Spain. He had been brought by an owner to the Americas to be enslaved there, and he had escaped on an earlier voyage that stopped in Guadeloupe. And they happened to see this man by accident. And immediately the Spanish decided, well, he is actually a Spaniard, and we should take him back with us. He should not remain here. And they begin to try to convince him and eventually to compel him to come with them, promising him freedom, that he will not be enslaved, and so on. And he clearly, very politely, is trying to tell them to stop, to go away, that they should just spend the night and leave, and they will not listen. And then finally, early the next morning, the indigenous people on Turuquera basically attack the Spanish, and they target, in fact, these Spanish missionaries, these Jesuit missionaries for particular, they target them. It's clear that they are not just going after everyone who's on the ship, but they're targeting them, and it is actually, they are defending this man who is a member of their community. He has children there, he has a wife there, and as far as they're concerned, he is a member of their community, he is a part of their society, and they will not allow the Spaniards to take him. So they force them to leave. So up until the point where it becomes clear that the Spanish want to kidnap this man, everything is fine. Once it becomes clear that they intend to try to take this member of the community with them, then all hospitality is over. So if we fast forward then about 100 years to the early 18th century and to the island of Yurume or Guadeloupe. By this point, between the time of that earlier story in 1613 and the 1720s, when this next story takes place, the African enslavement in the Lesser Antilles has expanded tremendously. And the island of St. Vincent has become, in many ways, one of the last completely autonomous remaining centers of what had been this inter-island civilization, where these islands were interconnected, connected by the sea. European colonization has now turned the sea into a space of warfare and enslavement, where it had been a space of life and interconnection. And St. Vincent becomes this last remaining sort of stronghold of this other world. And European descriptions of St. Vincent in the 18th century sought to claim that there were these deep divisions between the people who they called, and I'm using colonial terminology here, the so-called yellow or rail Caribs, people who they said lived on the Western Caribbean coast, which is where all the harbors where large ships can dock. That this is where the sort of rail indigenous people lived, and that African interlopers who pretended to be indigenous lived up in the hills on the Northeast coast, which is on the Atlantic coast, which is not, you can't land ships there. And this is kind of the geography of many of these islands, where you have these harbors on the Western coast and much more rugged landscapes in the Northeast, which is more mountainous. So they claim that this was evidence that there were these deep divisions between these two peoples. But as I've read these sources over the last number of years, what has become much clearer is a much more beautiful and complicated history, where what people, as slavery expands, what people seek to do is to protect the members of their communities in these islands who are most vulnerable to enslavement by making choices about the spatial geography of where people will live. So that by the 1720s, people who, because they are of darker complexion, are most vulnerable to the dangers of predation from enslavers are protected in the hills. And villages where people are perceived by Europeans as being quote unquote real indigenous people tend to be along the eastern coast of St. Vincent. And that is the kind of spatial residential geography that these societies create in order to maintain their freedom, but as well as maintain the freedom of the members of their communities who are most vulnerable to European enslavement. So this is an incredible world that in many ways, it survives right through until the end of the 18th century, when the British launch a war that leads that, and in that process, they commit a genocide against the people of St. Vincent to destroy this world of Afro-Indigenous autonomy. And they actually exile large numbers of people based on their skin color. They choose the people of darkest complexion and exile them to Central America. Right? If I could move to the third slide. So in my final 2 minutes, I just want to focus on some of the legacies and the memory that people carry with them of both this trauma, but also this other history of solidarity. So this is Lucia Ellis. She is a healer and community elder. She is one of the descendant of one of the 2,000 people who survived this exile to Central America. She's from Belize. And this was the moment when she arrived first on an island just off St. Vincent that was part of this Afro-Indigenous world, where the British actually first exiled people and then re-exiled them again to Central America. And this is the moment when she first arrived to this place, which was both this moment of extreme violence, this horrific moment of extreme violence that her ancestors suffered, but also, in a sense, the rebirth place of the Garifuna, the Indigenous Garifuna diaspora, of which she is a descendant. And to me, this moment where she landed on this beach and she knelt and she cried. But it's also a moment that, to me, this is the anti-Columbus moment, with this Afro-Indigenous woman who affirms the survival of herself and her people through this return to what they understand to be homeland. The word Yurume, which is the Garifuna word for St. Vincent, means homeland. And if I can move to my final slide, so I can try to keep to time. And then this is an image that, for me, when I think about this history, this image, which is from the 2016 Black Lives Matter occupation of the Toronto Police Headquarters, really speaks to this, I think, to these legacies. Many people don't know this history, but we live them. And I think they resurface in our struggle. They resurface in the ways that we occupy the streets. We carry them with us in many ways in our memory. And at that police headquarters occupation, throughout the entire time that Black Lives Matter occupied the police station, members of the Mohawk Warrior Society stood there, sort of stood guard with the Warrior Society flag and the two-row wampum flag for the entire time. And so Karyn, Recollet, and I were there, and we took this picture, which to me really speaks to how, even if people don't necessarily know the hemispheric scale of these other histories of solidarity, they enact it at different moments repeatedly. And so I want to offer this as a moment that really connects this deeper history and this other space of the Caribbean to our own place here. And I think it speaks to who we have been, who we are now, and who we might become as human beings. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Professor. And I know it wouldn't be right if I didn't speak with the muted microphone. So just to move on and welcome our second speaker, Shawna Sweeney. The floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here, everyone who's tuning in. I apologize in advance for looking down at my notes, but I'll try as much as possible to engage the camera. Thank you for being here today virtually in solidarity with Scholars Strike. I'm also grateful to my colleagues, particularly Professor Melanie Newton and Professor Elisa Trotz, who've helped to organize this, and everyone working behind the scenes. But I'm also particularly thankful for the organizing and agitation efforts undertaken by people across the world this spring and summer in response to anti-Black and anti-Indigenous police violence. Aside from being a spring and summer that was full of grief and losses untold, it's also been a time of truly inspiring activism that should give us hope that another better, more just world is possible. So my brief remarks today are rooted in reflections, rooted rather in the connections and insights that my students have helped me to make over the past 2 years in a course that I teach called Climate Change and Colonialism. I developed this course as part of a broader effort to reframe the conversation about climate change away from its current neoliberal presentist orientation, an orientation that often insists that if individuals just make greener consumer choices, climate disaster can be averted. And indeed, I think this retelling or the climate change narratives that we're all accustomed to, especially as they pertain to environmental racism, can occlude the kinds of solidarities that Melanie's presentation so elegantly highlighted. So what I'd like to present rather is, in the class, what I try to present, is a longue durée view of climate change, one that understands environmental degradation as inextricably linked to the structures of what Cedric J. Robinson called racial capitalism since at least the 16th century. In a racial capitalism analysis, a racial formation itself is not something external to or epiphenomenal to capitalism or its development, Rather, the notion that non-Europeans were fundamentally different from Europeans and thus less deserving of freedom, land, food, or sovereignty actually came out of a racialism that itself was born in Europe and subsequently shaped the development of predatory regimes of accumulation, such as Atlantic slavery and settler colonialism. What happens, I ask students in my course, if we were to look at the foundational moments of Indigenous and Black Europeans and thus less deserving of freedom, land, food, or sovereignty actually came out of a racialism that itself was born in Europe and subsequently shaped the development of predatory regimes of accumulation, such as Atlantic slavery and settler colonialism. I think someone's not muted. Sorry. Okay, I'll proceed. Sorry about that. So what happens, I ask students in this course, if we were to look to foundational moments of Indigenous and Black dispossession that constituted racial capitalism as a starting point for the so-called Anthropocene, rather than the usual modern, how we usually trace modern climate change to a post-1945 world order. So today I want to briefly sketch what I think a departure point for such an analysis might look like when we, for example, conceptualize the sugar or cotton plantation as a site of environmental as well as physical destruction, and hint at the political implications of a shared story of environmental racism that provides the grounds for mutual aid, custodianship, and subsistence among Black and Indigenous peoples. So to start, the term environmental racism, which we hear, if you're involved in climate change conversations or environmental history conversations, is everywhere, emerged in the United States during the late 1970s and 1980s out of struggles against organized social abandonment that accompanied deindustrialization and the so-called white flight from American cities. The term captures well the racist effects of neoliberal austerity measures too, specifically the kinds of deregulation that rendered poor people more vulnerable to cancer, asthma, and lead poisoning, for example. These conditions clearly indicated a willful disregard for the lives of Black, Latinx, and Indigenous peoples living in cities on the part of municipal, state, and federal authorities. It's worth pausing here to consider what I think is a really useful definition, Ruth Wilson-Gilmore's definition of racism, which is, quote, state-sanctioned or extra-legal production of group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. We might think here also about Dean Spade's argument that government apportions life chances in particular ways that render certain communities illegible and thus disposable. Environmental racism is not only, to me, about specific, specific kinds of environmental degradation, but it's also a kind of governmentality that renders certain communities surplus and therefore worthless in the eyes of the powerful. There's no question that environmental racism helps to explain developments in the urban US context, and that the term has been useful to activists working to remedy the racist effects of corporate pollution. However, I would argue that this traditional framing of environmental racism in general precludes the kind of transnational comparisons and histories that can illuminate structural long-term trends and can also illuminate possibilities for solidarity. A longue durée environmental history of racial capitalism can help us not only make sense of enduring anti-Black and anti-Indigenous violence, but may also help us to forge stronger bonds of solidarity between Black and Indigenous communities. So one contemporary example that I think shows the ways that communities experiencing fairly similar events are narrated differently has a start at the US-Canadian border. So separated by only 112 kilometers or just under 70 miles, Sarnia, Ontario, otherwise known as Canada's Chemical Valley, and Flint, Michigan, where the Aamjiwnaang peoples and African Americans respectively are subject to extreme forms of environmental racism, are not often held in the same conversation. So Sarnia, Ontario is, like I said, home to Canada's so-called Chemical Valley, which means that within a 15 square mile area, over 60 petrochemical plants whose toxic operations, it's home to over 60 petrochemical plants whose toxic operations make the air quality in Sarnia the worst in Canada. The burden of Canadian toxicity is not shared equally. Pollution is concentrated on the lands of the Aamjiwnaang peoples, who suffer higher rates of miscarriage, cancer, asthma, chronic headaches, to name just a few afflictions. And the reason I say my comments today are in part about the connections my students have made is because as a Canadian who's lived here since I was 3 years old, I had no idea about this particular community and what it was experiencing and the struggles they experienced until my students, a few of my students wrote about it. And since then I've learned about the decades of activism that elders and other local folks have been undertaking, but including some colleagues here at U of T. But it's really, I think, something that's not talked about enough. So it's worth noting that this community was first consolidated too as a reservation in 1827, following extensive dispossession at the hands of the British. Like so many other communities living through the trauma and exploitation of environmental racism, these conditions are rooted historically in the ways in which settler colonialism and extractive capitalism conspired simultaneously against Indigenous lives. While local activists and allies have successfully mobilized to stop the construction of some additional refineries and toxic businesses, the daily reality of living under these conditions in Sarnia persists. Across the border, not more than an hour and 20 minutes away, is Flint, Michigan, a predominantly African-American city. Flint was at one point home to some of the highest median incomes in the US for industrial workers in the 1960s. The General Motors plant was the heartbeat of the city and employed and sustained nearly all of its residents. In a story familiar to many Rust Belt towns, the progressive downsizings by GM that went from, at its height, employing 80,000 workers in 1978 to just over 8,000 in 2010, cratered the city's population and subsequently its resources and its importance to the state economy. After a series of social and economic crises and the austerity policies of the early aughts, Flint became perhaps best known for its more recently, for its public health crisis, the one faced in 2014 and 15, when its underfunded and neglected infrastructure poisoned the city's water with lead. The contamination of the city's water supply led to an estimated 10,000 children being poisoned and many more adults, although the effects are more severe in children. The effects of lead poisoning in children are devastating and can be permanent. It's unknown how many children in Flint will live with permanent neurological and/or physical illnesses from this poisoning. As I speak, there's been no comprehensive remedy for Flint's water crisis, and residents have to rely, if they can, on bottled water or expensive specialized water filters for clean drinking water. As in the case of Sarnia, there's a deeper history to the African-American presence in Flint. Many folks arrived in this northern industrial city as refugees from the violence and super exploitation of Jim Crow capitalism in the South, which replaced slavery in the wake of the Civil War. So both of these examples of environmental racism, each one in Sarnia and one in Flint, have a deeper and more complex histories, of course, than my cursory gloss will allow for. But what I'm struck by is how differently each case is narrated in the popular media, and in turn, what it can tell us about Black and Indigenous environmental exploitation and racial capitalism. Current frameworks for understanding environmental racism are, as I noted earlier, largely based on the ways that legislators fail to regulate polluting companies or to mandate cleanups in Black and brown communities. And while there's no problem with this definition per se, I do think that told through these traditional legislative framings, with their emphasis on local, regional, or national environmentalist policies, we miss the structural effects of racial capitalism and the ways that Black and Indigenous communities less than 120 kilometers away from each other, in this case, share in similar histories of dispossession rooted in what historian Gerald Horne might call the apocalypse of settler colonialism. We also lose out potentially on opportunities for mutual aid and support that are, in this case, rooted in shared geographically proximate histories. African and Indigenous dispossession were the cornerstones of racial capitalism in both the United States and Canada. We tend to talk about slavery, understandably, primarily in terms of labor, but it was also an environmental regime. The expansion of sugar and cotton plantations not only ruined the soil, but required the dispossession of indigenous peoples. Plantations also enclosed or encroached on previously unenclosed habitats. While land is critical to discussions of settler colonialism, we must also remember that it involved the commodification of nature and the destruction of environments. Two more well-known examples are the disappearance of the beaver and buffalo in certain regions of Turtle Island. So reframing slavery and settler colonialism as environmental, I think, can be crucial to our politics and our future survival. So finally, I want to end by saying that it's clear to me, at least through this course, that, and through my students' careful thinking, that racial capitalism has always in part been environmental. This perhaps explains why Black and Indigenous struggles so often revolve around land and subsistence. Indeed, the policing of Black and Indigenous peoples historically has often served to divorce them and remove them, dispossess them of both land and access to food. I wonder if we can think about subsistence and land, especially in the current moment when both are threatened by climate change, as a building block for Black and Indigenous solidarities where contemporary or traditional environmental narratives don't see those connections, drawing on shared pasts and presents to inform our future survival. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Shauna, for your presentation. Hopefully, people can see me. Okay, great. So what I wanted to do next is just not take up any more time on my part, but just wanted to hand it over to Professor Tamara Walker to give the third set of comments, and then we're going to get into the question and answer later. So for everyone that's watching on Facebook, just wanted to say there's over 100 people watching right now, and we're not the only session, I believe, that's going on at this time. So that's really incredible. I wanted to say thank you all for taking the time to tune in and showing us love. But there's going to be time for you to submit your questions, so feel free to put your questions in at the Facebook chat there. And without that, I'm going to hand it over to Tamara.
Thanks, Kevin, and all of you for tuning in. I wanted to use my time today to connect our conversations about anti-Black racism and police violence to Latin America, which is the region that I focus on in my research. Specifically, what I wanted to do was both sketch and provide some historical context for understanding the challenges that Afro-Latin Americans are facing, some of which resonate with what's happening in North America and others which are specific to the region. Obviously, I can't cover the entire region with the time that I have today, so I'm going to just take us on a brief tour of a couple of places that I think best illuminate the issues and the stakes that bring us together today. So to start, let's talk about the parallels to the North American context, because there are many. In Brazil, just to give one of numerous examples, police killings of civilians and Black and brown civilians in particular are at an all-time high. And it's a familiar situation from where we sit here in North America and Canada and the US, in that police officers have been emboldened by a president with hateful rhetoric and really dehumanizing rhetoric, among other things. He has said that criminals should, and I quote, die in the streets like cockroaches. And he has also expressed a commitment to ensure that these police officers who are heavily militarized will face few, if any, consequences. The officers also have the media to support some of their actions, in that they use the media to distort narratives and turn victims into aggressors. So one example that I wanted to draw attention to today had to do with the height of the pandemic, the height of the lockdown in April, when teachers and volunteers in a community in Rio de Janeiro were handing out food and supplies in this community. And effectively, they were stepping in to provide services where the state had failed to do so, and engaging in a kind of solidarity action in the absence of that kind of support, which is something that has deep historical roots and has played out in the present day. But in that moment, in providing services where the state had failed to do so, providing food, providing resources to community members, young and old, police officers opened fire on this distribution. And in the process, they killed a 19-year-old who was there to receive the support, to receive the solidarity. And in their account of this incident, police officers left out any mention of the food distribution action that was taking place. And instead they painted this young 19-year-old victim as an aggressor who had drugs and weapons on him that, in their accounting of this incident, therefore justified his murder. Another problem that this links up to is the way in which police officers manage to clean up crime scenes. They will take victims of police shootings to hospitals and basically distract from the fact that they were responsible for these actions. And so it's impossible to trace the officers' involvement, even though community members are deeply aware of their involvement. And one of the consequences has been that there's been a disruption in these food distribution activities, these service projects, these solidarity actions, precisely because of the fear of police opening fire and further endangering a community that's already tremendously vulnerable. So that fear is driving people to step away from the kind of community support that their communities rely so deeply on, which is not coincidental, right? And not unintentional on part of the police officers and the state, to put things more directly. So as we can all imagine, this only exacerbates the public health crisis that we're all living in the era of COVID-19. And we can imagine parallel scenarios playing out in the US and here in Canada. They're likewise playing out in other parts of Latin America and having disproportionate impacts on African descent and indigenous populations. In Peru, for example, these are similar issues in terms of the impact of the current pandemic on Afro-Peruvian and indigenous communities in the region. These groups are experiencing a pandemic within a pandemic within a pandemic in certain ways because police violence is disproportionately affecting those communities. Women in particular, Afro descent and indigenous women in Peru often find themselves being doubly victimized when they find themselves looking to the police for help when they have been victims of domestic abuse, which is a pronounced issue in Peru as elsewhere in Latin America and certainly elsewhere in North America. But it results in their being harassed and assaulted by police officers, which in turn leads them to be disinclined to contact police officers when they are most in need of help and assistance. So this is just one of many issues that are plaguing African descent and indigenous populations in Peru. To speak more specifically to the African descent experience in the region, which is what I'm familiar with in my own research and scholarship, only 10% of Afro-Peruvians make it to college or make it past post-secondary education. And of that 10%, only 1.9% of them actually graduate. So they're being woefully underserved by the educational system and the higher educational system in their own country. Added to that is the fact that 19% of Afro-Peruvians under 18 years old are outside of the educational system altogether, not receiving any form of formal education. So this paints obviously a very brief and incomplete picture of the experiences of anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, and police violence in Latin America, two distinct examples, but nonetheless with overlapping features. Because of time considerations, I can't go into detail about the particular demographic context of Brazil versus Peru, but those certainly are significant to the events that are playing out to some degree, but to another degree, it seems to matter less in a country like Brazil, with the vast majority of its population being of African descent. the problems are very similar to a place like Peru, where the African descent population is a relative numerical minority. So these are some of the kind of parallels and points of divergence that are worth thinking about. The next point I wanted to address today, and it's relevant to both the context and the reason that we're all gathering in this strike action, is how much trouble comes their way when Afro-Brazilians, Afro-Peruvians, Indigenous Brazilians, Indigenous Peruvians, and other African descent and Indigenous Latin Americans attempt to call out and address racism and police violence. And this is a problem that dates back to the 19th century, to Latin America's independence struggle, when patriotic movements across the region declared legal racial equality for all free citizens, and in the process constructed a nationalist ideology of racial harmony. This was something that was true in Mexico, in Argentina, in Peru, and in various other parts of the region, including in Brazil, although on a slightly different chronology and in a slightly different context. But nonetheless, this discourse was pervasive throughout Latin America, this notion that these were nations that were founded on the premise of racial equality. And that's a huge topic. It's a topic for another day. But for the purposes of today, I wanted to bring it up to point out that it resulted in two things. One was the erasure of racial terminology, largely at the archival level, at the level of the generation of documentation. This was something that I became aware of when I was doing my research in graduate school in Peru, attempting to follow the history of enslavement in the region in the colonial period into the modern era. And when I was studying these issues in the colonial period, it was very easy to find people who were racially marked, and marked by their legal status, whether enslaved or free, but also on the basis of their racial makeup, people of African descent, Indigenous ancestry, mixed racial ancestry. Only people of European or Spanish ancestry kind of escaped racial markings on the archival record. But by the independence era and by the 19th century, these racial labels disappear from the archive, which adds to the sense that these were no longer nations that established status and rank on the basis of race. It was obviously at odds with lived experiences and practice, but it did have an impact and continues to have an impact on the archive and on the work that we do as historians grappling with those archives. So that's one consequence of that rhetoric from the 19th century that is enduring and persistent and a tremendous challenge for truth telling about the past. But the other challenge that it presents has to do with the present moment, which is that it creates the idea, it has long created the idea and continues to enforce the idea that talking about race and talking about racism is in itself racist. There are so many examples to point to of this sort of discursive cudgel. One has to do with the attempts to redress issues of racism and inequality in places like Brazil. For example, Brazil had a brief experiment with US-style affirmative action programs. There's an interesting documentary on PBS's Frontline that touches on this issue. And one of the really compelling things, I use this documentary in my teaching all the time, one of the really compelling things about this documentary is that the elite Brazilians, the white Brazilians who are professors and administrators and policymakers who occupy positions of power and authority, really took issue with the idea of implementing US-style affirmative action or even quota systems, which at one point they were grappling with, and dismissed it all as introducing race as a concept, and by extension, racism into Brazil, where these concepts and these issues previously did not exist. And so it becomes a way of silencing any potential conversation about redress or reparative justice. Also, on a less sort of policy-oriented scale, it plays out in popular discourses around race and representation. One example that comes to mind that I have my students watching today during the strike action or listening to is a podcast episode about Blackface minstrelsy in Colombia, which is alive and well in the 21st century, or until very recently was alive and well. And it involved a depiction on part of a white Colombian man of a Blackface character that attracted a lot of controversy and scrutiny, especially from Afro-Colombians who felt dehumanized and disrespected by his display. And in response, the actor who performs this Blackface character argued that criticizing his character and depicting that the criticism of his depiction is what was racist, that the depiction itself was affectionate, loving, and anyone who saw anything other than that affection and that love was projecting their own racist ideas onto the character. So it had a way of, in many ways, silencing the critique. In the end, he ultimately did, owing to outside pressures, eliminate the Blackface performance. But in the podcast episode, it's clear that he has not learned a lesson. And it's not surprising given the enduring weight of this rhetoric of racial equality that becomes a tool of silencing any attempt to draw attention to racial inequality and to racism, and even issues of police violence in Latin America. This, of course, doesn't put the work on part of people of African descent and indigenous populations in any particular peril. Those groups are devoted to their quest for racial justice and equality. But I think it does lay bare the stakes of that work in terms of who gets to diagnose the nation's problems, who gets to opt out of working towards any solution, and who is ultimately left to do the work of reckoning with the past in order to ensure a more equitable future. So I'll end on that note and look forward to our discussion now.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Tamara, for that. And what I just wanted to do for a second was just to jump back, sorry, because we're monitoring a couple things at the moment. Just the Facebook comments that are there to go through. I don't believe there's been any questions that have been posed because people are thinking incredibly deeply right now. So I appreciate that. But I also wanted to thank, before we move into the Q&A, and I have a couple questions. We can also open it up to the other speakers that are here. If you wanted to add something or respond to one of the other people, your fellow panelists, we can do that. I just wanted to thank African Studies, Professor Miriam Lowe, as well for the support in helping this happen very quickly, as well as Professor Alyssa Trotz and the very good people at Women and Gender Studies, who, along with everyone here, it's been a collaborative effort, have put it together rather quickly. So just really proud of everyone, and shout out to everyone for doing that. And thank you to everyone that's joining us online. Okay, so I'll open it up to the panelists. If there's anything that your fellow colleagues had mentioned that you wanted to respond to, and if not, I do see that there is a question that did come in, but I'll if you don't have anything to say, then I'll ask the question.
I don't have anything yet.
Okay, so the question that came in, there's a couple questions within it. So I think it's two questions in one. So then I'll read it, and then just perhaps we can spend a couple minutes going addressing it individually. So the question is, if the nation state has proven to be so harmful to indigenous people and people of African descent, why do we continue to train students in nationally bounded histories of indigenous people and people of African descent? How might we better teach our students to think hemispherically, or at least transnationally? Does anyone want to go first?
Yes, in the interest of time, I can go, I suppose. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I want to thank whoever posed the question. And I have a lot I could say, but I'll try to keep it brief. So I would say, I think the study of the Caribbean and in a lot of ways, the study of Latin America as well actually fundamentally challenge those nationally bounded approaches to history. So certainly that's the approach I think all of us who teach in Caribbean studies and also who teach in African studies, like so the programs that have sort of all come together to make this happen today, we all are fundamentally challenging those nationally bounded histories. And yet at the same time, I think it's important to recognize that Black and Indigenous people frame their conceptions of freedom in a lot of complex ways. And some of those ways do involve sort of mediating different scales, whether it's the national, regional, and international scales. And so I don't know that I wouldn't say that any of those is illegitimate. And it's really important to understand that people can have affinities at all of those levels, even as they challenge them. So, you know, speaking as a person from the Caribbean who does operate at all of those scales at once, I think we should not necessarily always assume that any of those scales, like I think people have taken those different levels of sort of community and worked with them, reimagined them, made them their own, and operate within them at different points depending on the circumstances. And I think it is important to learn from that and not to just sort of easily fall into what was, I think, first the imperial effort to just impose the nation state on people, or I think what might be an equally knee-jerk effort to just sort of say the nation state is no longer at all relevant to any of our analysis. I think we have to really learn from how it is that people are articulating what those mean in their everyday struggles. So that's what I take from the way that particularly Afro-Indigenous people and Indigenous people across the Caribbean operate at all of those different levels at once.
That's great. Just wanted to see if anyone else, either Shauna or Tamara, you wanted to jump in.
No, I thought that was a fantastic answer. I would just say that I think there's something to be said for taking both tacks to root ourselves in geographic and historical specificity while also acknowledging these points of convergence and coalition building. But it's a fantastic question, and I think an assignment for us to think about the next phase of how we go about training in these fields.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the answer was entirely comprehensive and adequate. I would just say that to me, in some instances, it's not the nation state itself that's harmful, but the particular power that it wields. And when we're talking about historical narratives, the way that it comes to overdetermine how we tell stories, that excludes us from seeing the connections that are necessarily there, especially in regions like Africa and the Caribbean and even Turtle Island. So, but again, like Melanie said, respecting the ways and the multiple levels at which people understand their affiliations or claim their sovereignty is instructive for us.
Great, thank you. So just something that came to mind as I was listening to the presentations, but also that last question that was just asked is, because we're lucky to have 3 historians on the panel, right? 3 excellent historians. So I'm not trying to put anyone on the spot, but just as, you know, how we opened up giving the land acknowledgement and mentioning the connections between people of African descent and Indigenous peoples in North America, in Canada in particular, because that's where we are right now. I just wanted to ask you if you could think of any other examples of Indigenous and African or Black solidarity in Canada. So the things that come to mind, they're sporadic, they're moments, but I think they're really important. Is if people have been following what had been happening with the occupation of out front of City Hall with Afro-Indigenous Rising, which I think is a really important grassroots connection between young people of both groups, or when we started to see you know, these kind of more organic connections happening between Idle No More and BLM with their respective occupations. And then I think the photo that Professor Newton had put out in her presentation kind of captured that. But again, I think there are moments, but maybe do you have any examples? It doesn't have to necessarily be Canada, it could be United States, it could be in Latin America, where a linking of these groups has actually brought some kind of increased space for building an alternative or holding space to build alternatives. Anyone want to jump in?
I think, because I see we have a question, another question from the audience, so I want to answer quickly. I think that just like the story that I told about St. Vincent, I think there are a lot of these moments that are not, they are there, whether or not they get sort of archived. You know, like there's a way in which I think, you know, colonialism and its forces constantly seek to disrupt any our attempts to construct a narrative that is built on these moments of solidarity and cooperation, but they do happen. And so, I mean, I can think of, you know, like many things. Like I think like some of the initiatives, for example, of like a different book list that they do, that they have done with Indigenous community. Like they're just, there's so many. But I think there's definitely a way in which, particularly if like me, you're not raised here, like you have to really go out of your way. Like they make it's made very difficult to know and to learn, and to construct a narrative of being here that is based on those moments of solidarity. But they are very, very much there. Absolutely. I see we do have a question from the audience. Kevin, do you want to read that out for everyone to hear?
Or maybe I can read it in the interest of time.
Yeah.
Sure. This is from Shauna Thompson, who asked, do you believe in the study of history, we do not hold accountable enough the Africans and those of the African diaspora who willingly decided to digress from servitude and progress with enslavement regarding slavery? In other words, what are we supposed to do with the fact that in the history of slaveholding societies in the African diaspora, there were people of African descent, whether born free or enslaved and able to gain their freedom, who became slaveholders themselves? And that's something that comes up quite a lot in the courses I teach on slavery in Latin America. My students last semester, for example, were really stunned to read an article by the historian Danielle Terrazas Williams, who talks about an African descent woman who, among other people she held in bondage, held her own brother in bondage. And I think what that shows is just how corrosive the institution was, that it led to people holding their own blood, their own family members in bondage as their means, their perceived only means of attaining status and privilege in the societies in which they live. So I think that it is complicated in certain ways, but I think not as complicated as we might think it is, because what it does is really diagnose the depths of the depravity of the institution of slavery, that it would result in those precise scenarios that we now are encountering as historians or students of the past.
If I could just say one other thing, I think I completely agree with that slavery is an incredibly corrosive institution, and it does roll all people in society into a situation in which, in one way or another, their fortunes, particularly if they're free people, no matter who they are somehow tied to this institution. So it's really, it's very complicated. That being said, I think we should not overstate the statistics in terms of slave ownership in the Americas clearly show that it was a racialized institution that privileged white people as slave owners, regardless of their socioeconomic status, although the very wealthiest, of course, owned the most land and the most human beings, and ensured that Africans and their descendants were most likely to figure in the economy of slavery as human property. So, and then the broader economy, the emergence of global capitalism based on the insurance industry, insuring plantations and slaving voyages. These are based in Europe and North America. You're not going to find a situation in which you have an African insurance company and African shipbuilders and African ship owners, sailing African-owned slave ships to the Americas, to African-owned plantations, and this is not going to happen. So it's very clear where the racial capital of slavery is concentrated.
I think that's a really important point to highlight. I just wanted to invite Shauna back if you're still here with us.
Her Wi-Fi went down.
Oh, the Wi-Fi went down. Okay. because it's taking note of the time that it's 1 o'clock, so we're gonna switch over just to let people know, and also for Shawna as well, while she's reconnecting with us, is that once we have our next two speakers, we're gonna bring all 5 panelists back for a discussion. Okay, so there'll be time for everyone to be able to contribute to the discussion. So I just wanted to hand it over to the moderator for the second panel, going from 1 to 2, which is Professor Melanie Newton.
Okay, so hi, welcome back, Shawna. So I want to, first of all, thank everyone for being here today and for signing in. It's amazing to see so many people. And I want to, before I start, just send a lot of love and support from all of us to Safia Gahayr, who suffered a loss in her family and found out about that today and could not be here with us today. But she's in our thoughts. We love her. We hope we can do something like this with her again, but she is grieving and we should all, hold her in our hearts, right? So I want to introduce our next two speakers, two amazing women. So our first speaker will be Karyn Recole, who is an assistant professor in Women and Gender Studies. She teaches Indigenous feminisms here at the University of Toronto. And Malavika Kasturi, who is an associate professor of history in the Department of Historical Studies at UTM. And of course, in my job as moderator and previous panelist, I forgot to bring with me the sentence topics for your talks, but I know that Karyn will be speaking on abolitionism and futurities in Black and Indigenous solidarity and survival. And Malavika will be having us think transnationally about the ways that Hindu nationalism mobilizes some of the narratives of solidarity and freedom in very problematic ways from Black and Indigenous struggles here in Canada. So I hope I've summarized those appropriately. And I turn the floor over to Karyn and to Malavika.
Thank you. So my name is Karyn Recollet, and I'm very honored to be a part of this conversation. I've been listening and witnessing a lot of the conversations that have been held these past couple of days, and I'd like to just express my gratitude for all of the emergent strategies and knowledges that have been shared, the histories, the difficult histories, the ongoingness of these difficult histories, and just sending my love to everybody at this particular moment in time, which is also very challenging and difficult. So what I'd like to talk about today is this idea that I've been kind of thinking through and alongside Indigenous thinkers, Black thinkers, regarding sort of where we are in this particular moment and how are we gesturing towards the future. So I'm seeing a lot of conversations around land acknowledgements lately, and I think that these conversations are critical, crucial, very important spaces through which people can come into relationality with each other. And what I'm doing is I'm witnessing all of these articulations, enunciations, and deeply listening to the types of gatherings that are being created into Toronto, but also thinking about, my ancestors, my kin that lives in the prairies, thinking about holding space for the solidarities that are emerging in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, all over Turtle Island. And so what I'm going to be talking about is my positionality as what I call a diasporic Cree 60 scoop survivor. So what that means for me and how I come into relation with amazing friends, relations, chosen kin into Toronto that include Black and Indigenous folks are thinking about, sorry, somebody is cutting their lawn and I can't really do much about it. So I'm going to share with you some reflections that I have as I come into this space. thinking about a provocation of coming into relation and sharing a poetic of possibilities. So as I was reflecting upon the conversation held yesterday by Cyrus, Marcus Ware, and Raven Wings, I thought about how I come into conversation. So I'll just share this short poem that I wrote in reflection. Geographies, choreographies of futurity, future ancestors, intimate lives, interior lives, livability, poetics, water, landing, diaspora, magic, joy, love, gatherings, citation, breath and breathing, otherwise respiration. My responsibilities to practice radical citational practices, to ask consent, to listen, to read and read and read, to remember what appropriation feels like in my body, to remember how it tastes, to be in relation without desiring sameness, to read, to continue to love words the way that they feel together, but to keep listening after I have fallen in love with a word, a thought, a practice, knowing that it's not mine, to keep listening, even when the idea is super desirous, super wonderful, it's not mine. To answer a call when being in relation, when asked to be in relation, to reimagine together, to learn to participate, to learn how to witness, to be brave, to bring my fullest self, to be thoughtful, to be humble with what I don't know, to heal, to work on myself, to process, to move, to walk, to witness, to be my fullest and truest diasporic Cree self, to be a futurist, to examine histories, to observe flight patterns, and to witness atmospherics. I just wanted to start with that because I wanted to state sort of my, rather than a land acknowledgement, sort of a landing acknowledgement. How do I land and come into relation? And to be self-reflexive about that as an Indigenous person coming into relationship with Black feminist scholars, with Black geographers, with Black community organizers and artists. So I wanted to take some time to actually be thoughtful about that, about how I land into place, into this particular space, and into these particular experiments, into these particular maps to tomorrow, into this particular futurity space. So what I've been seeing and what I've been observing and what I've been at times participating in are processions of care. Processions, I'm thinking about street processions as activations of Indigenous and Black gathering sites that are mobile, that are always on the move, that are necessarily so on the move. As a series of futurity landing glyphs, this is how we land together. And rather than sort of a stillness or a staticness to a glyphing practice, I see what's emerging with these incredible movements are these ideas that you don't have to be landlocked in order to be free or to be Indigenous, to be Black. That it is in our motion and our mobility and our processions of care that we fall into each other and also imagine the possibilities of creating something new. So I'm thinking about the call and responses, the sonic reworldings that happen during moments of possibility as speculative, almost processions that are dreaming of these alternative sites, these alternative worldings and landings. It's interesting to me that a lot of the processions are happening, of course, on city streets. You know, City streets are also made up of concrete, of bones of ancestors, of spaces, violent spaces. And here are people coming together to process on these streets in these spaces of incredible violence, brutality against Black and Indigenous bodies, that these also can become sites of possibility. So it makes me feel like a lot of the gestures and choreographies of processions of care are actually probably mimicking the kinds of processions that happen in Sky World, in Star World. And that's where I think about sort of my constellation thought about the constellations in the sky are atmospherical gatherings. If we think about the dish with one spoon, it brings thoughts of Mr. Musqua, the Big Dipper. No, you know, it brings thoughts that the kinds of worlds that we want to embody are the kinds of worlds that are already existing up in the star worlds, in sky worlds. And in my understanding of Cree landing stories, landing tellings, or landing geographies really, is that we come from the stars. So our gatherings, our processions are celestial. And so when I'm seeing all of these gatherings, all of these processions, I'm seeing the 1492 land back movement. I'm seeing Nathan Phillips Square. I'm seeing what's happening, or what happens in front of, you know, City Hall, in front of the police building, in front of monuments. That these are all these landing glyphs of Indigenous and Black futurities, expressing the otherwise possibilities of how we can be in radical relationship with each other. The gestures of these processions are also very interesting and beautiful. And there's so much work that's being done, writing about these choreographies of futurity, really. Thinking about the fist up, you know, thinking about how Indigenous folks also carry tobacco in their hands closest to their heart, and thinking about that in relationship with the, you know, with gestures of livability, of abolition, of freedom that Indigenous and Black bodies are inhabiting, are embodying in this particular moment. So I think I'll just quickly speak a little bit more about that. So when I'm thinking about constellatory atmospherical patterns, we can also think about what I call an Indigenous femme futurist glyph, which is a star blanket. So a star blanket is basically mimicking the constellation, which is the Pleiades. And the Pleiades is a hole in the sky. I'm learning this from Elder Wilfred Buck. A hole in the sky, which is a portal to an otherwise. So I see a lot of these gatherings, a lot of these processions that folks are in solidarity with each other in choreographing and in activating, that these are sites of possibilities that are in relationship to the celestial, to the atmospherical. And there's a lot of connections between the ways in which we think about the atmospherical. I'm thinking about Aamjiwnaang First Nation. I'm thinking about the use of toxicity in the air to silence and to still land defenders. I'm thinking about, you know, a pandemic and the implication of cutting down trees during an airborne pandemic. So, you know, atmospherical, there is so much there to think about together in terms of how we can proceed, how we can create these gathering sites and to further our own technologies of care that come from particular spaces in our genealogies and our histories and as future ancestors. I think I'll end there for now and maybe pick up on the conversation as it continues.
Thank you so much, Karyn. That was wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so now we will move to our final speaker for today, Malavika Kasturi from Women and Gender Studies. Malavika?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
I think I wanted to show a few slides. I'm not sure if Melanie?
Don't worry, Kevin has them.
Okay, all right. So I'm sorry, I'm actually not going to be using too many, but there are a few things that I wanted to actually gesture towards because they're actually, it's quite important because not everyone might be familiar with Hindutva and the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, and it's sort of it's the political body, the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is currently in power in India, and it's actually very powerful in the diaspora, including Canada. Some of you may have read a lot of really sort of interesting revelations about the connections between hate speech and Facebook, which in fact go back to this highly problematic sort of political formation, which in fact is also working in North America, in the United States, and in Canada. And it is particularly pertinent I thought, to discuss them at this point in time, especially when we are talking about solidarities. Now, it would have been much, much easier for me to talk about the progressive solidarities that are taking place. And there are plenty. So, and I want to sort of, and I totally, that is something I can talk about in the question time. But right now, I would like to actually talk about the what I see as not just problems, but the sort of something that is currently hidden, not because it is not there out there in the public domain in North America. It is fully out there in India, but the fact that we need to identify groups who actually sort of practice a form of Hindutva, which is a sort of a cultural and political ideology based on Hindu supremacy. It shares a lot with white supremacist sort of narratives and assumptions. And what is sort of, when we talk of solidarities, I want to point out to the ways in which the ecosystem of Hindutva, which actually is which flourishes in North America, on Twitter, on Facebook, on different forms of social media, which also hides behind different organizations and sort of penetrates universities, student bodies. I think it's very important to have an awareness of this, especially at a time when organizations and bodies like this are in fact appropriating terms like race and indigenous in a way to subvert these really important struggles and solidarities for racial justice. So I'm just going to be a little sort of pedantic here and just step back for a minute. If I could go to the next slide, which is actually to tell you a little bit about the Sangh Parivar, or the family of this organization, which is and why it is so important. So there were two bodies in the sort of in the colonial period in India, when the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which is it was formed in 1925, as was the Hindu Mahasabha. The Hindu Mahasabha is important because its president from 1937 Veer Damodar Savarkar, he wrote a very important book called Hindutva, which actually laid out the most important sort of, if you like, assumptions of Hindutva, which is this political, cultural, and racial, ethno-nationalistic, majoritarian sort of ideology, right? So, and I'm going to sort of show you a few quotes from that. So V.D. Savarkar becomes the president of the Hindu Mahasabha. However, there is another body which in fact was to surpass the Hindu Mahasabha and become extremely important, and that is the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh that was formed in 1925. And the RSS, when it was formed, I'm going to call it the RSS from now, it actually called itself a cultural body, which it was not. It was always a political body, and in fact, it expanded and in fact incorporated the idea of Hindutva, and in fact broadened it and in fact connected it to the idea of what it called a Hindu Rashtra or a Hindu state, which was its ultimate goal. Very important to say that both the Hindu Mahasabha as well as the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh were formulating their ideas at a time when fascism was on the rise in Europe, and in fact particularly in the work of Golwalkar, We and Our Nation Defined, which I'm going to refer to in a minute. There are open references and in fact very obvious links which are being made, and in fact Hitler's Germany and the fascist model, and also Golwalkar referred to approvingly as the final solution, were actually seen as ways in which they were seen as models to attain Hindu Rashtra or a Hindu nation. So this highly troubling organization expanded between 1925 and 1947. It didn't gain that much political traction, and in fact it was banned for a short time in 1948, after 1948 for a year, because one of the person who assassinated Mohandas Gandhi, or Mahatma Gandhi as he's known, in January 1948, had links both to the RSS as well as the Hindu Mahasabha. However, the ban was lifted in the interest of democracy in 1949, provided that the RSS recognized the Indian flag and the Indian constitution. Up to date, it has its own flag, which you can see, saffron flag, and in fact, there it has a very ambiguous position towards the Indian constitution, which in fact it wants to replace, and not ambiguous. It has a very open position, and it has a very ambiguous position towards the flag. Having said that, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh is very important for us today because it in fact generated a plethora of organizations, political, quote unquote, cultural, and charitable organizations. And right from the beginning, it was very, very clear in its mandate that it was in fact it had a transnational mandate. So in fact, in 1950, its first political party, the Jan Sangh, was formed, but this was later disbanded and replaced by the Bharatiya Janata Party in 1984, which is currently in power in India today and has been since 2014. Outside, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh has actually many different branches in both in all parts of the world, but as we are talking of Canada, both in Canada and in the United States, there are chapters of what is called the Hindu Swayamsevak Sangh, which is also very, very active in the GTA, very, very active in the United States. In fact, and this is distinct from the Bharatiya Janata Party itself, has its own organization called the Overseas Friends of the Bharatiya Janata Party. But in addition to this, there are a large number of other charitable organizations which use community fronts, student fronts, and which are in fact amongst us. And in fact, what is very important is for us to be able to identify and to know at this time when these fights for racial justice are taking place, the ways in which these groups seek to, in fact, incorporate some of the with very pernicious sort of goals, the languages of race and indigeneity. If I could just have the next slide, I'd just like to show you a little bit to explain what I mean. So these just are, this is just, Savarkar and Golwalkar, the two, if you like, chief architects of the of Hindutva, which since then has sort of escalated and sort of it has moved and changed. And here in North America and Canada, Hindutva has tried to adapt itself and sort of, in a sense, appropriate and subvert and sit inside very progressive, and radical categories. So Hindutva is something that is not, it's an idea that keeps changing and moving, and it's very, very creative. And so that's why it's very important for us to identify it. If I could have the next slide. So, so, I mean, I just want us to reflect for a moment, because I want to emphasize the importance of race and the way it is understood by M.S. Golwalkar, and which in a way undergirds Hindutva. And not only then, but it has in many ways this is the sort of, if you like, these are really important, three really important assumptions, which in fact the way in which the various fronts of the RSS engage with various movements like BLM and try and strike solidarity, that actually they're much more in common, and they're also in conversation with white supremacist groups. So the idea of the Hindu Rashtra, right, according to Golwalkar, was that which expressed the whole of the idea contained in the English word nation, but even went beyond it. So he suggested, as building on Savarkar, that this was a civilization, quote unquote, which was, that was at once cultural as it was racial, as it was territorial. So, and this was, and that idea of the idea of Hindu Rashtra, which it was sort of very, very closely linked to the idea of the Aryans, quote unquote, was something that the argument that was made that existed from time immemorial, right? So the most important thing about this idea was that that Hindus were a race, they were a nation, and had been until, in fact, they were subdued. They were, they had been sort of, they were imprisoned until they were humiliated. And this period in both Hindutva and particularly for Golwalkar started from 1200, which sees the beginning of the Delhi Sultanate and Mughal rule. And this entire period, of course, it goes without saying that this notion is based of a united Hindu race is based on one that believes in others, right? And the most important external others were Muslims. And so in this telos that is actually sort of created and crafted, and this is the way in which history and the idea of past and presence are spread in the Hindutva ecosystem, both in India and abroad, is the importance of the regaining of the power of the Hindu race. And in order to do that, to gain independence, as to quote Savarkar, the power of the national race must stretch over the entire land from sea to sea, right? And this was in the past, and it was endowed with wealth of every description, and this is a goal that has to be realized again. And so in order to do that, implicit in that was, and it was actually quite explicit, was the idea that the Hindu race had to sort of rise out of its slumber, organize, and fight its enemies. And the goal of this Hindu Rashtra must be Hindus by religion and culture, and consequently by language, to be really included in the concept, right, of the quote unquote ancient Hindus. Now, this is highly problematic, to say the least. If I could have the next slide, thank you. So this is a highly problematic idea. Now, after the RSS was banned then it came back in 1949 and it formed its political party. It sort of toned down on the explicitness of these ideas, but the party manifestos of first the Jan Sangh and later on the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is now in power, actually incorporated all the foundational understandings of Hindutva, which is really important for us to understand, because it is one that is, it has inbuilt into it Islamophobia, inequality, violence, racism. And this is exactly what is important for us to know here in Canada. But here I want to draw some very important transnational links. The BJP under Mr. Modi has been in power twice, 2014, and again with a majority in 2019. Now, let's make no bones about it. This is a majoritarian government. And in fact, there have been, right from the beginning, there has been an escalation in India, which unfortunately has not made headlines in Canada, but as elsewhere in the world, for the rise in Islamophobia, lynching of all forms of minorities, especially Muslims, a rise in organized, orchestrated acts of state violence against Muslims, most particularly in February 2020. And what is extremely important but equally important, is the attempt to stifle dissent of every kind. So anybody who does not agree with Hindutva is in the process of being arrested, put in jail, false police cases, and this has been used particularly so under COVID. Now, what does it mean for us in order to understand the ecosystem of Hindutva in the diaspora? I think it's a lot. One, a large number of these groups have actually, been very involved or tried to get involved and sort of stretch out sort of solidarities in the past 2 years. They've been very, very active. They've been quietly propagating quite openly propagating amongst the diaspora, not all the diaspora, but they're trying to sort of move into into campuses, into schools, and sort of in many senses use and in fact before Black Lives Matter, use the language of multiculturalism to sort of push the agenda of Hindutva as as Hindu heritage and so on and so forth, which is highly, highly problematic. But I want to point here towards something more pernicious, and that is the expansion of the right-wing ecosystem, which in a way, through Twitter, through and through different forms of protest, which in fact increasingly is using the term Indigenous Hindus. So this is sort of what is really interesting in the past 4 years, or in fact longer, has been the rise in the term Indigenous Hindu. And the term Indigenous Hindu in fact picks up from Golwalkar's understanding of this ancient India, this Hindu nation that was stamped out and pulverized and faced numerous forms of genocide, quote unquote, for which reparations need to be sought. Now, so the term indigeneity here means something completely very problematic and suggests something that in fact which is something that is incorporated into a lot of hashtags on Twitter, and also into a lot of different sorts of meetings in order to try to forge and to be on the same page as anti-racism, movements of anti-racism, right? So, so you could see the most common hashtags are, Indigenous Hindus, Indigenous Lives Matter, Brown Lives Matter, Hindu Lives Matter. So, Hindu Lives Matter. So in a way, these are very pertinent and very important because they are hashtagged especially on Twitter feeds and on social media sites, on Facebook, and in a lot of webinars, events that take place in Canada, which are pushing hate speech and also Islamophobia, and also the Hindutva agenda. So I think it's, I am here to actually sort of strike, in a sense, to be the cautionary voice in a way, to ask, to also say, and that there are many, many progressive voices out there. We are talking of, stretching hands out and solidarities of different kinds, and those are happening. But at the same time, what is not happening, and what we need to see, and what we really need to begin to see, is the attempt to subvert and to actually to take these to kind of to take these categories that we've all been talking about, and to use them for very, very different ends here in Canada. Thank you. So I'm sorry, Mel, I may have overshot my time.
Some things they take time to explain. This is life. Thank you so much to both of you. So I think, looking at the time, I think maybe we can open up to questions to all of the panelists, but I'm sure that we will have questions for both Malavika and Karyn. And I encourage people to just spend a little bit of time maybe focusing on questions for our most recent speakers. So I think I'm gonna turn it over to Kevin to moderate, because I can't really do moderating and take questions. So yeah. So I do see a couple of questions here, so we might start with those. So Kevin, do you want to read those out?
Yeah, sure. So we have a question that came in from Shauna Thompson. So the question is, so this is, does the Hindutva, I'm saying that wrong, had or currently incorporate the concept of the caste system to not associate with non-Hindus only within India, or does this also go as far as throughout Asia and the regions of Asia that were connected to Africa?
Okay, so to answer this very simply, it's very, Hindutva technically says that there should be that, caste and all other forms of hierarchy within the Hindu nation have to be erased. But having said that, what is sort of interesting is that Hindutva has a very ambiguous, in fact, a very violent relationship with, and in fact reinscribes the caste system, and in fact hounds, particularly those Dalits, who are sort of fighting for the erasure of the caste system. I mean, I can't assume familiarity with everyone, but and in fact, even now as we speak, in India is arresting people who who have spoken out against Hindutva, and sort of putting false cases on them. So and as far as caste is concerned, I think we've had a recent case in the United States, the Cisco case, which makes it very, very clear that not Hindu, the caste exists even amongst the diaspora in South Asia. So that doesn't necessarily answer both questions, but just the first question from Alyssa: how is anti-racism mobilized as an alibi for racial supremacist sentiments and actions? What are the diasporic implications? How does it permeate schools, campuses, other institutions? Is that for me or for? Should I try and answer that?
I think it's for everyone.
Yeah.
Okay, so would you like to go first, or should I?
I think maybe
Okay,
what we could do is we could have you answer, and then we could pass it to Karyn, and then
fine.
try to bring in everyone else that was on the previous panel.
Okay, so the thing to just the way anti-racism is mobilized is particularly at the time when, for example, Black Lives Matter broke out, or there are movements to defund the police and so on. What is sort of interesting is that a lot of groups who are Hindutva groups sort of participated, but very ambiguously, because these but for the most part, were silent. None of them are interested in defunding the police. In fact, they are all in support of supporting police atrocities and state violence in India. And, but do unfortunately play the, I mean, this is not to say that race is irrelevant. I'm not discountenancing that at all. But I'm saying for groups such as these, sort of, they appropriate these categories, you know, of, first of all, the Hindutva is very uncomfortable with the idea of blackness. So that comes up in Kamala Harris, for example. So when Kamala Harris was first appointed as, you know, the vice presidential campaign, it was very interesting to follow the debates where, you know, especially in South Asian Twitter feeds, which are dedicated to Hindutva, which was struggling with her mixed heritage and in ways that were very problematic and very racist, right? So there is there is that part of it. But the other part is also the cooperation of groups like this with white supremacist groups. Right, that is something, that is a part that we sort of do not, we must not underestimate. So for example, in the US, there is a very important constituency called Hindus for Trump, right? And they get a lot of their money and funding from India, from the BJP and from the RSS, and also from, and many of these are citizens of the United States. And this might well be the case in Canada. We don't know yet. This is something we still have to find out. In terms of, so the diasporic implications are huge, because both in the United States and in Canada, particularly in Canada, I mean, we have a huge diaspora of South Asians. And we have many who come from India and many who are sympathetic to the BJP and what's happening in India, and who actually sort of fund these organizations. They fund these fronts also in India. Very often, they also fund student bodies and councils. Sorry, they fund student councils on campuses, right, that are funded by the RSS, that are fronts for the RSS. And that is also the case in our university, at U of T. We also, there are also, for example, those who are sympathizers of Hindutva also are on TDSP, they're on school boards, right? So there's a particular take on quote unquote Hindu heritage, which is actually, in my opinion, needs to be revisited. The thing is, there is no visibility in Canada. I think it is important to acknowledge that the presence of groups who are sort of not only supporting what is happening in India, which is, and there have been huge protests in India, which in fact, between December and April, December and March, and when COVID put a stop to that, and a lot of the protesters are now being arrested. But I do think that it's important for us to know about the ways in which these messages are sort of being spread through universities, through students, and also, you know, more importantly, diasporic funding to universities, whether it's chairs, whether it's events and other things like that.
Okay.
So thank you for that contribution and the answer. So I'm just going to read out the question again for the other panelists that are here. So the question is, how is anti-racism mobilized as an alibi for racial supremacist sentiments and actions? What are the diasporic implications, and how does it permeate schools, campuses, and other institutions? So I'm going to hand it over to Karyn to give your thoughts on this, and then we'll go through to have Karyn, then we'll jump back to Professor Newton and the others.
Thank you. So in response, I would suggest that I'm kind of paying attention to the languages and the vocabularies that are being activated in particular sites, particularly what kinds of languages and vocabularies diaspora sort of makes possible for Indigenous folks to articulate ways that life can be more livable on stolen territories in the wake of all of the violences that Black and Indigenous folks are experiencing. So one of the ways in which I feel my my practice into the conversation is as a witness, to kind of think through what are these, I guess, geographies of Indigenous and Black being in relation with each other more than human beings, and landing practices, that in these treaty relational spheres, there are all of these complexities that we all articulate from very multiple scales of being in the world that we activate on the daily. So for me, it's been helpful to really think carefully and closely alongside Indigenous and Black geographers, historians, placemakers, folks who are like really engaged in what the hidden geographies of Toronto are, and particularly on the University of Toronto. Like, we think about the lands that the University of Toronto is occupying, and thinking through what can these languages from and hidden geographies that Camille Turner, for example, is articulating, thinking through the Grange project, the First Story projects that are articulating hidden geographies, hidden Indigenous geographies, the Ogama Makana project, that to me, I choose to really spend time learning about these hidden geographies as ways to shape possibility for alternative ways of being together in space. And that's my answer.
Okay, great. No, I think it might cut off a little bit at the end, but just wanted to pass it over to Melanie to respond. And if you want me to repeat the question, I can.
Yeah, if you could, actually, because I was listening to people's answers and I forgot the question.
Definitely. So the question is, how is anti-racism mobilized as an alibi for racial supremacist sentiments and actions? What are the diasporic implications, and how does it permeate schools, campuses, or other institutions?
Right. So just a little question then. Yeah, I think it made me think a little bit about the earlier question about the nation state. And I was thinking about both the ways that, sort of Karyn was talking about these radical relationalities, at the same time that we have to think about some of the ways that, all of the states that we sort of move through, the nation states that we move through, whether it's Canada, the United States, nation states in the Caribbean, the nation state of India, that they are all, in so many ways, they are the successor states of empire. But they occupy very different relationships to that legacy of empire. So it's nation states in the Caribbean are post-slave and post-indenture states. And they don't occupy the same kind of power or privilege. They are themselves racially dispossessed in the world order, but that does not mean that they cannot engage or seek to make use of the same kinds of state practices that dispossess Indigenous people and the non-white poor. They also treat the poor, whether they are the descendants of an indentureship or of slavery or Indigenous dispossession, they do treat them as though they are disposable. So they themselves are often completely complicit, even as they seek to very much, they sort of position themselves and do represent a legacy of decolonization. They also carry over many of the same legacies of colonial practice that they're inherited, because they're as invested in those as their colonial forebears. And so I think it really, like those kinds of subtleties where we don't just, I think there's a problematic way, I'm gonna try not to waffle here, but there's a problematic way in, I think a sort of transnational thinking about solidarity recognizes that the inheritor of colonial power is not just the North American settler, but these other states, these other sort of colonizing or dispossessing states, as it were, can't be understood only through that language of the settler. We need another language that accounts for those histories and that accounts for the forms of dispossession that they experience, but also the forms of violence that they are capable of and absolutely willing to propagate. In the case of Hindutva and in the case of some of the anti-Indigenous and sort of racially divisive practices of Caribbean states in the present. And so I think, yeah, I think it's, I can't answer the question specifically necessarily about campus politics, but I think it's important to recognize that part of solidarity, and I think this is why it's so important that we heard what Malavika talked about, is taking the time to understand these different historical trajectories of dispossession and to really sit with that knowledge and to take that information about how people come to be where they are and come to be here as part of a fundamental politics and practice of solidarity.
Okay, no, thank you so much for that. There's a lot going through my head that there's a lot of questions I want to ask after, so I'm going to bug you probably after the chat for that. I just see, I'm going in order of the people that are on the, like my gallery here. So I see Tamara, that you're next. If you wanted to jump in, if you want me to repeat the question, happy to.
No, I was just going to answer one reading of that question by reflecting on the statements that a lot of institutions, schools, corporations, and others have made in the wake of the BLM protests over the summer, because they have all, including our own institution, adopted these statements to showcase their commitment to anti-racism and their zero tolerance policies for racism. And it got me thinking about this instance that happened in my home state of Colorado a couple days ago, involving a young boy who had a toy gun on his desk, and it passed his screen, and the teacher saw it, and in her reporting of the incident accused him of waving the gun on screen that somehow posed a threat to his classmates, that then resulted in the police being called on this young Black student. And people have approached the school for a statement, and the statement the school has made has been that they do not tolerate, they're reading from those statements that they issued over the summer, right? They're saying they do not tolerate racism of any kind, and therefore that becomes a cudgel against the complaint that the teacher was displaying racist action against the student. It becomes this kind of teleological cudgel where we don't stand for it, therefore that can't be what happened. And instead they're pointing to it being some other violation that then makes the student who was the victim in this situation the aggressor. So I think that's a situation that played out in the way it did at this particular school and in this particular setting, but is unsurprising for the way it's ultimately played out in ways that dismiss any responsibility for the teacher's racist actions and redirects the conversation, because we've all decided, we've all agreed that we do not stand for racism, so that can't possibly have been what was going on. So I think this moment is really interesting because those statements will now be wielded in I think really surprising and also not surprising, but ultimately still devastating ways.
Great, thank you, Tamara. So Shawna, you're next if you wanted to respond. And again, I can also state the question again if you want.
No, that's okay, thank you. Just really quickly, I think I'll read the question perhaps in a slightly different way, but drawing on Karyn's really useful answer about hidden geographies, I'm thinking about anti-racism as an alibi, or as Tamara said, as a cudgel in some cases, as also a form of corporate anti-racism that we have to be vigilant about recognizing. And so I've been thinking about the ways in which activists and community members have been reclaiming space, particularly around the monument discussion. And so recently there were anonymous kind of heritage plaques that mimic the heritage plaques that the city, or maybe they're federal, puts up around Toronto, that identify spaces where slave owners or a legacy of slavery was present in Toronto, particularly around like Baby Point Crescent, Baby Point Road, Jarvis, William Jarvis was a slaveholder. And so I feel like these kinds of fugitive monuments mean so much more than if we were to convince the government to put up the right kinds of monuments. And again, kind of maybe in conversation with some of Karyn's comments, the kinds of processions that people are able to put together in these kind of fugitive moments, I think are really important and can speak to or can be a kind of buffer against the kinds of rote corporate anti-racism or cynical corporate racism or cynical diversity politics that they try to use to actually silence what people are demanding, which is a full accounting of the violence that people have experienced and how to remedy that. So those particular anonymous heritage plaques have been really inspiring to me.
Okay, great. So I just wanted to take note of the time. We have 4 minutes left. So I realized that there was a lot of incredible and very insightful things that were said, well, the past 2 hours, but also just with that last question. And I think Shauna's point about how these kinds of moments can get co-opted is really important to take note of, because I think that's what the university and its role, in incremental liberalism is really good at. And that it's easy to be a critic, I think, and I'll put that hat on, but I think what would be incredible is to see this kind of labor stoppage on behalf of Black, Indigenous people of color that are faculty at another time when it is more disruptive as well, because of the first week of class. I think in that sense, it's really important, but it's just other conversations that were happening offline. I know like there's a lot, it's not necessarily for the school, but to have these conversations and make sure they keep happening, and also try and connect them to actions. And maybe that's something that we can have a discussion about as well, because I did see another question that came up and we don't really have time for it, is about how we would be able to carry this momentum forward, and whether or not the university is actually the place for these kinds of initiatives to take root, or if we're going to be part of them, how do we do it? But it's a bigger question. I know that I don't have an answer to, but we have a couple minutes if someone wanted to do that to sign us off. Otherwise, we can just call it a wrap and continue the discussion in other venues.
I guess I think I'm sort of doing the wrap up. So I guess I will wrap it up by saying, I think in response to that question about where we go from here, every space is the space for struggle. Wherever you find yourself, that's where your struggle is. No space is insignificant. And we all get a few, in a way, our lifetime. Speaking as a historian, we bring with us the struggles of our ancestors and we pass them on to those afterwards and after us. And we have a few years that is the span of our lives to do the best we can where we find ourselves. So wherever you are, there's your struggle. So I really want to thank all of my colleagues and friends who this came together in like 2 days. And we were still working out the technology like 15 minutes before. And you were all amazing. And I think this is an incredible start to our year at a very difficult moment for all of us. But I think we see this is the moment for us in many ways to figure out who we want to be when we, all come out in a way of our current isolation. And, there are many directions that can take, and those struggles that have brought us to this point, they live within all of us. So I really want to thank everyone who was part of this, to the audience for being here, to Scholars Strike and to Scholars Strike Canada for creating this moment for us all to come together like this. And, thank you. Go forward with love and solidarity, and to Safia Gahayr, who is not here, but was with us in spirit. And yeah, thank you all so much.